when a false alarm turned civilians into the enemy. No gun. 1950. A line of families was walking away from the war, and the war decided they looked like it. This series is about battles lost to chaos, lost to panic, bad information, broken communication, exhaustion, and ordinary human mistakes. Not to shame the people in the story, but to ask the question that makes your stomach drop. How does something this senseless happen, and what does it teach us about systems under stress? Korea, summer of 1950. The war has barely begun, and already it feels like the ground is moving under everyone's feet. North Korean forces push south hard and fast. Towns fall, roads clog, units retreat, regroup, retreat again. Maps don't match reality. Orders arrive late. Rumors arrive early. If you want to understand why no gun-re happened, you have to start with that atmosphere. A young war, a collapsing front, and soldiers who are being told, sometimes explicitly, that the enemy is not only in front of them, he's behind them, he's inside the crowd, because one fear has started spreading through the ranks: infiltration. The idea that North Korean soldiers are slipping through the chaos disguised as civilians, hiding among refugees, probing the line, cutting units off when they're already shaking. Whether it happens often or rarely doesn't matter once the fear takes root. The moment you believe it can happen, every civilian movement becomes a tactical problem. And that is the first failure point, a human problem disguised as an intelligence problem. Now imagine what that does to a tired unit holding a road in unfamiliar country. You are hungry. You are sweating through your uniform. You haven't slept. You don't speak the language around you. You've watched your positions crumble. You've heard stories about what happens when you get surrounded. And someone tells you the enemy may be hiding in those people. Your brain doesn't hear may. Your brain hears will. On the map, track the American retreat toward the southeast, toward the last defensible perimeter that will become the Pusan line. Along those roads move thousands of civilians, families carrying bedding, cooking pots, babies, old men leaning on sticks, kids dragging bundles that are heavier than they are. They are not thinking in military terms. They are thinking in one word: away. But war doesn't care what they're thinking. Near a small village called No Gun Re, elements of an American cavalry unit take up positions after a hard, confusing withdrawal. The job is simple in concept and brutal in reality. Hold the line, keep the route clear, stop anything that could be enemy. In a clean battlefield, that's a defensible mission. In a collapsing one, it becomes a trap. Because anything that could be enemy quickly turns into anything we can't explain. The refugees arrive in waves. At first it's small groups, then bigger ones, then a mass. Some have been told by South Korean authorities to move. Some have been herded by the noise of fighting behind them. Some are simply following the road because roads feel like safety. When they reach American troops, they are stopped. They are stopped. Weapons are taken, tools, knives, anything that could be read as intent. And then they are ordered off the main road and onto a set of railroad tracks running nearby. Picture the geometry of that decision. A road is wide. People can spread. A unit can manage them with distance. A railroad line is narrow, elevated, exposed, linear. It's a funnel. It turns a crowd of individuals into a single moving mass, easy to watch, easy to block, and easy to misread. The refugees are told to sit along the tracks, to wait, to stay where they are. Adults glance at each other and then at the soldiers, trying to translate posture into meaning. Children get thirsty. People fan themselves in the heat. Nobody knows what the plan is, because there isn't one. There is only control. And then the second false assumption hits. Aircraft appear overhead. In a war full of confusion, air power depends on simplified pictures, movement, clusters, shapes on the ground. To a pilot, a large group along a rail line can look like a column. A column can look like an enemy relocation. And if the briefings in the air match the fear on the ground, infiltrators use refugee groups. Then the brain in the cockpit runs the same shortcut as the brain in the trench. Uncertainty becomes hostile. The planes attack. Strafing. Bombs. The sound is sudden and absolute, an argument you can't answer. People scream and scatter, not because they're guilty, but because the sky is trying to kill them. Now look at what happens next through the lens of chaos. The refugees panic and run. To them, it's survival. To nervous soldiers trained to fear infiltration, it can look like proof. Why would a harmless crowd run like that? Because bullets don't care who you are. But a frightened mind doesn't think that far. A frightened mind thinks they ran because they are the enemy. The crowd surges toward the nearest cover, a railroad underpass, a concrete double culvert beneath the tracks, two dark tunnels that cut through the embankment like a mouth. People pour inside, pressed shoulder to shoulder, trying to disappear into shadow, and that underpass becomes the center of the catastrophe. Because from a distance, a mass of civilians in a tunnel doesn't look like families hiding. It looks like a group taking cover. And in a war where you've been told the enemy hides inside civilians, cover is not innocent. Cover is what combatants seek. This is the moment where a reasonable security order, stop the flow, keep the line, meets exhausted men, darkness, rumor, and fear. And the system stops making sense. Gunfire begins. Not a neat volley. Not a clear command followed by disciplined action. By many accounts, it starts ragged, bursts, pauses, then more bursts, shooters responding to movement, to sound, to the panic of the moment, soldiers on both sides of the underpass, firing toward the openings, machine gun fire, raking the mouth of the tunnel, rifles cracking in the heat, inside, people flatten to the ground, mothers cover children, men try to pull the wounded back from the openings. Those near the front get forced backward by the press of bodies behind them. People whisper prayers, people cry out, people go silent. And the nightmare of a false alarm is that it doesn't need a villain. It needs a trigger and a cascade. A rumor that says infiltration is possible. A policy climate that treats refugees as a threat vector, a unit under stress that cannot verify identity. An airstrike that cannot verify identity. An airstrike that converts confusion into terror. A crowd survival movement interpreted as hostile intent. A tunnel that concentrates civilians into a single mass. A line of soldiers who, in the absence of clarity, copy the behavior around them. Once the first shots are fired, everything else is momentum. Because firing is contagious. The sound tells everyone's nervous system, we are in a fight. In a fight, you don't want to be the only one not shooting. In a fight, hesitation feels like death. So the cascade continues, minutes stretching into hours, hours bleeding into the next day in some accounts, until the underpass becomes a place where time is measured by the gaps between bursts. Now here's the hardest part. What exactly did the soldiers believe they were doing? This is where sources diverge and where we have to be honest. Some veterans later described being convinced that enemy soldiers were among the refugees, or that they were taking fire from the area. Some described orders to stop refugees from crossing lines because infiltrators were expected. Survivors described sustained firing at trapped families with no way out. Official investigations later struggled with the same problem that created the event, the fog of war. Memories conflict. Records are incomplete. Statements disagree. Even the number of dead is disputed, with estimates ranging from dozens to several hundred. But there is a core truth that doesn't depend on perfect numbers. Civilians, refugees, were killed by American air and ground fire at No Gun Re in late July 1950 after being funneled to a rail line and trapped at an underpass. And the mechanism of that killing was not a grand plan. It was a chain reaction built from fear. This is what lost to chaos looks like. Not just a battle lost, control lost. Now step back and look at the human psychology, because it explains how decent people can participate in something monstrous without feeling monstrous in the moment. When your environment becomes unpredictable, your brain craves a story that makes it predictable again. The story doesn't have to be true. It just has to be usable. Infiltrators or hiding in refugees is a usable story. It turns ambiguity into a target set. It turns moral uncertainty into a tactical decision. It turns, I don't know, into, I must act. And under stress, action feels better than thinking. Another psychological trap is what you might call the first shot trap. The moment a weapon fires, it changes the social physics of the group. The threshold has been crossed. Now everyone must decide in seconds whether that shot was justified, because if it was, you need to join in to survive, and if it wasn't, you still have to act like it was, because the consequences of being wrong are immediate. That is how groups commit terrible acts in real time, not by waking up evil, but by being pulled step by step into a reality where each next step feels smaller than the last, until you look back and realize you've walked off a cliff. So what does a system have to do to prevent this? It has to preserve categories. It has to keep civilian and combatant distinct even under pressure. It has to define escalation rules that don't rely on vibes like stop them. It has to build verification pathways, challenge procedures, interpreters, controlled corridors, anything that turns I can't tell into I can tell enough to not shoot. Because the single most dangerous rule in any organization is this: if you can't identify, assume hostile. That rule feels safe. It's actually lethal, and no gun shows why. The environment made identification hard. Language barriers, massive movement, fear of infiltration, and a retreating army. The system response made identification harder, funneling refugees into a compressed mass, placing them in exposed positions, then responding to panic as if panic were intent. Once the refugees were in the underpass, every survival movement, every hand raised, every body shifting, could be misread as threat. And because bullets were already in the air, the misreading didn't need to be proven. It only needed to be believed. Afterward, the war moved on. Fronts stabilized, armies built routines, the early chaos hardened into structure. But no gun didn't disappear. Survivors carried it, veterans carried it, and decades later, it returned to the surface through investigation and argument, because events born from chaos don't end cleanly. They echo. Official reviews acknowledge that civilians were killed, but debated intent and orders. Survivors insisted this was not crossfire, not a brief exchange, but sustained fire into trapped families. Veterans remembered fear, confusion, and warnings about infiltrators. The record became another battlefield, because chaos doesn't just kill people, it fractures truth. So here is the system lesson you can take without flinching away. A false alarm is not just a misunderstanding. A false alarm is not just a force multiplier. It mobilizes fear before it mobilizes facts. It weaponizes uncertainty. It turns ordinary orders into deadly permissions. And in war, where everyone is already tired, already threatened, already primed to believe the worst, a single mistaken assumption can spread faster than any messenger, until an entire unit, an entire chain of command, is acting on a reality that isn't there. Because in war, the enemy isn't always the army in front of you. Sometimes it's the moment your own system stops making sense. And when that happens, the people who pay first are usually the ones who had the least control over the situation to begin with. The civilians caught between panic and procedure, mistaken for a threat because the system could no longer afford to ask what they really were. This was No Gun Korea, 1950, a massacre triggered not by strategy but by the collapse of identification under fear. A battle lost to chaos, control lost to chaos, control lost to a false alarm.